Hi, this is Matt McCormick at the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. My email address is mccormick@csus.edu, and there's my web page address. This is the second of two lectures about how to reconstruct arguments for my critical thinking class. So let's get started on that discussion. So there's several new things we need to work on, and I want to illustrate and want to show about how to move from a piece of text, an argument that's laid out in text, and put it into the formal reconstruction pattern and template the way we've been doing things. So my instructions from last lecture have been that the first thing you need to do is figure out what the conclusion is. So here's a very short argument. The reason people should be allowed to sell their kidneys is that there are many people who'd like to buy them. So here's a Rand Paul libertarian kind of argument. So the first question is, what's the conclusion? And since the author says the reason people should be allowed to sell their kidneys, that the reason phrase there tells you that what follows is the conclusion. So in this case, the conclusion is, therefore, people should be allowed to sell their kidneys. And then we want to look and see what information. Our next step, of course, is to see what, if any, explicit premises there are that will support that argument. So if I just sort of divvy up everything that I've been given, I've got this premise 2, there are people who are willing to buy kidneys, and that's something the author said, so we're calling that an EP, an explicit premise, and there's 3, which is the conclusion. But you'll notice that if you just look at 2 and 3, that argument as it stands is not well formed yet. It just says there are people who are willing to buy kidneys, therefore people should be allowed to sell their kidneys. Okay, so there's no premise or no connecting principle here that connects up the notion of buying and selling, and it looks like the author seems to assume that his author has an implicit premise that's a general principle that's supposed to apply here that connects these two ideas and makes this argument valid. So in the order to achieve this notion of the principle of charity, we're going to reconstruct this argument and add a premise here that the author clearly seems to be relying on, and I'm going to do it this way. There's some other ways you could do it, but let's try it this way. If there are people who are willing to buy something, call it X, then people should be allowed to sell X. There are people who are willing to buy kidneys, therefore people should be allowed to sell their kidneys. So when I add that implicit premise, you can hear now that this thing becomes valid. So that's good. Adding the implicit premise is necessary to make this argument well-formed, where a well-formed argument is valid or cogent. And the author is clearly relying on something like this principle in order to make it work. So now we've got a well-constructed reconstruction of this argument, complete with justifications and 3 lines. Now that I've got that argument written up, I'm going to take a moment just to make a side note. One of the things that argument reconstructions does is that it allows us to focus critical evaluations or objections on very specific parts of the arguments now. So what we're doing right now is just reconstructing arguments, but let me just use this opportunity to talk and look ahead about how we'd object to an argument. Notice that the problem with this argument is now apparent. The problem is premise 1. Premise 1 says if there are people who are willing to buy something, then people should be allowed to sell that thing. Well, we can think of lots of obvious counterexamples to 1. That is, I think you should probably be doubtful about 1. I am. Here's why. Here's some counterexamples that illustrate why 1 is false. Nuclear weapons, slaves, children, missiles, and we can come up with lots of other examples. So those are exceptions to the rule. Those are things that certainly people are willing to buy them out there, but we shouldn't allow people to sell them. So those are examples that show why 1 is false. The mere fact that people are willing to buy something doesn't mean that other people should be allowed to sell them. So this argument, in fact, is weak, or it ought to be weak by the time I've finished this objection to it, because you've got some good reasons to doubt 1 now. Nevertheless, we did a good job of charitably reconstructing the argument on behalf of the author, and these objections are the author's problem now. Okay, so let's consider some other reconstructions. Here's another argument. Look, I know this bugs you, but yoga is not exercise. And whenever I run this argument by my friends, it makes them very mad. Any activity that doesn't get your heart rate up or doesn't make you sweat is not exercise. Okay, so we won't talk about the problems with this argument just yet. We want to reconstruct it and reconstruct it charitably. So here's this guy who thinks that yoga is not exercise. What are his reasons? Well, first off, I've already given it away. The conclusion is yoga is not exercise. So that's the conclusion. Now, what, if any, explicit premises have we been given to support that conclusion? Well, this author, the second sentence, thinks any activity that doesn't get your heart rate up or doesn't make you sweat is not exercise. So if I just leave this argument at what we've been given explicitly, I've got 1 and I've got 3. But pretty clearly there's a gap here because there's an assumption, there's an implicit premise. This author's relying on this notion that what's wrong here? What's missing? Well, the explicit connection between yoga and not getting your heart rate up or not making you sweat has been left out. So we need an implicit premise again. Yoga is an activity that doesn't get your heart rate up or make you sweat. So now you can see the thing is valid. Any activity that doesn't get your heart rate up or doesn't make you sweat is not exercise. Yoga is an activity that doesn't get your heart rate up or make you sweat, therefore yoga is not exercise. So now you can hear that I've made it valid, and I've added an implicit premise. So we've got explicit premise, implicit premise, and then 3 follows from 1 and 2. Now I can't pass this up without saying a bit about the critical evaluation question. So again, charitable reconstructions are one thing, critical evaluations are another, and I want to separate those 2 phases, but I'm just going to use this opportunity to lead out and talk about what if anything's wrong with this argument. So it might be true that 1, any activity that doesn't get your heart rate up or doesn't make you sweat is not exercise. That might be correct. And it looks to me like the problem, or I can imagine that my friends are very enthusiastic about yoga. They think yoga will fix everything. It looks to me that I can imagine that the defender of yoga would protest about 2. They would say, premise 2 is probably false. Yoga, when it's strenuous, gets your heart rate up and makes you sweat. So 2 is false because, in fact, it does get your heart rate up and it does make you sweat. Now, I'll just point out here that doing Bikram hot yoga doesn't count. Doing yoga in a hot room doesn't count just because it makes you hot. Or else, if that's what makes it exercise, then eating donuts in a hot room counts as exercise too. So it can't be that. It's got to be the strenuousness. I think the yoga advocate has got to argue that the actual strenuousness, not the temperature of the room you're in, is what makes it exercise. Though just merely being in some hot place doesn't make it exercise, or else I'm going to go get a dozen donuts. Okay, so again, bracket off critical evaluation. Let's look at some more reconstructions, and we're going to get them harder now, more difficult. Here's a bit more complicated one. I was skeptical about the UFO abduction thing, but now I'm starting to believe that people are being abducted. Lots of people claim that they have been abducted, and the details of all their stories are eerily similar. If so many of them are saying the same thing, then they can't be making it up. Okay, so first question, what's this conclusion? What's this author arguing for? And it looks like this author's arguing not that I am starting to believe, but just that people are being abducted by aliens. Okay, so one of the things we're doing when we reconstruct these arguments is you trim out all the extra language. So that second sentence actually says, but now I am starting to believe that. Okay, we're going to leave all of that off and just say, just get to the point, cut it all out, burn this thing down to the bare essentials. And really what this author's arguing for is people are being abducted by UFOs or by aliens. That's it. Okay, now let's skim out the explicit premises. We've got an if-then sentence, and those ought to jump out at you now. If lots of people claim that they have been abducted by UFOs and the details of their stories are similar, then they can't be making it up. Okay, that's something this author said explicitly. What else? Lots of people claim that they've been abducted by UFOs and the details of their stories are similar. So that does, more of the information has been offered explicitly. So now if you were to just look at 1 and 2, what would follow from 1 and 2? And strictly speaking, if we just follow the letter of what's gotten said, is that 1 and 2 would imply that the stories about UFOs are not made up. Now, that's not quite enough. We need to bridge to get from 2 to 4, we need some kind of principle to get from this notion that, well, they're not making it up to they are actually being abducted by aliens. And here's a way to do it. One of my professors called this cheap validity, but I'll take it, it'll work. Add 3. If they can't be making it up, then it must be true that people are being abducted by aliens. And now when I put 1, 2, and 3 together, 1 says P, 2 says if P then Q, 3 says if Q then R, and 4 says R. Now I've got a valid argument. So that's a pretty good charitable reconstruction. I've added all my justifications, and I've made explicit all the intermediate steps. Okay. So, and I should point out here that arguments need not be 3 lines. We've seen lots of arguments that are 3 lines. Don't think they always have to be that way. And also, I should point out that the order of the premises above the line doesn't matter. Which line is called the conclusion matters, but the stuff above the line, the 1, 2, and 3 here, that can be in any arrangement. That really doesn't matter for our purposes. Okay, next argument. There's no avoiding the conclusion that. Okay, so before we say anything else, the author's just giving it away what the conclusion is. That is, the president should be impeached. There's no avoiding the conclusion that the president should be impeached over the debacle in Iraq. He either knew that there was no good evidence for WMDs, which is weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, in which case he's an outright liar, or he didn't know it because he didn't find out what his intelligence people did and did not know. And if it was the latter, then he's incompetent. So he's either a liar or he's incompetent, and either of these warrants impeaching him. Okay, so we've got the conclusion in the very first line, and then we've got a whole bunch of information here, a bunch of claims that are being made about why the president should be impeached. Now, one thing we ought to see here, you ought to notice that the one way to deal with these longer arguments is to break them into pieces and sort of see the big macro logical structure. And in this case, the giveaway is this either-or sentence. So he either knew that there was no good evidence for weapons, or he didn't know. He knew it or he didn't know. So my premise 1, either the president knew that there was no good evidence for weapons of mass destruction or he didn't know it. Now I've tuned that up, I've adjusted the language a little bit, but I'm calling that an explicit premise because that comes right out of that passage. So either the president knew or the president didn't know, and now I need a series of steps that will bridge us from the notion of if he knew, then he should be impeached, or if he doesn't know, he should be impeached. Either way. Okay, now what else did this author say explicitly? Well, if he knew that there was no good evidence for weapons of mass destruction, then he's a liar. Okay, there's another thing that's explicitly stated by the author. If he's a liar, then he should be impeached. How do I know that? I'm calling that an explicit premise. Well, the last sentence says either of these warrants impeaching him. So he's either a liar or he's incompetent. So if he's a liar, then he should be impeached. So now if you just look at 1, 2, and 3, we get an interesting outcome. Either the president knew or he didn't know. If he knew, then he's a liar. And if he's a liar, then he should be impeached. Okay, so I'm halfway there. I've constructed a valid argument for half of the result, which is the president should be impeached. One or the other of these two things is true. Both of them lead to the outcome of impeachment, and that's what's going to seal the fate in line 8. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3 imply if he knew that there was no good evidence, then he should be impeached. Now, what else do I have that's explicit in the argument? Well, this author says if he didn't know, then he's incompetent. Comes right out of the passage. If he's incompetent, then he should be impeached. So now if I put 5 and 6 together, I get if he didn't know, then he should be impeached. So now you can see, look at the justification I've given for 8. For 8, I've said the justification is 1, 4, and it should read 7. The president should be impeached. Why? Well, look at 1. 1 says either he knew or he didn't know. 4 says if he knew, then he should be impeached. And 7 says if he didn't know, then he should be impeached. So either way, he should be impeached. There's no way that 1 through 7 can be true and 8 be false. So this thing is valid. Now, I'm not going to spend much time critically evaluating this argument. It's nice that it's got this nice logical structure to it now. You may notice, or you may see, you may have figured out, and just thinking ahead to critical evaluations, what, if anything, is wrong with this argument? And I think the obvious thing is that while it might be the case that that lying is an impeachable offense, especially if you lie under oath, being incompetent, line 6, is not an impeachable offense. Look it up in the Constitution. There's nothing in there that says if you're a really crappy president, we'll impeach you. You got to break a law. You got to violate some constitutional duty, and just being incompetent is not laid out there. So the problem with this argument is that this guy thinks that merely being bad at gathering information from your intelligence structure is enough to warrant impeachment. This author says either of these warrants impeaching him. Well, impeaching is a constitutionally defined charge, and you can only do it in certain circumstances, and merely being incompetent is not enough. Okay, so there's a really complicated argument, but you can see how when I construct it lines 1 through 8, I get a valid reconstruction. And one of the things I'm bringing out here is the intermediate conclusions. I've got some sub-conclusions that follow from the premises, and that lets us tie the whole thing together. Once I get 1, and then I deduce 4, and I deduce 7, then I can justify 8. Okay, much more complicated. But in fact, it's a simple argument. Currently, the FBI and the NTSB, that's the National Transportation Safety Board, are considering 3 live hypotheses about the demise of TWA Flight 800. Mechanical failure is always the first option to be raised in such cases. Most plane crashes, like the recent one in the Florida Everglades, are due to something along these lines. The problem with this hypothesis is that most of the wreckage has been retrieved, except for some of the most crucial areas near the blast, and no indication of mechanical failure has become apparent. The possibility of a terrorist bomb on board is also being considered. It has happened a number of times before, and worldwide incidents of terrorist bombings are ever increasing. But again, there's no evidence, at least that's compelling, in the wreckage that there was a bomb. No terrorist group has plausibly claimed responsibility. The other possibility that is actively being considered is that the flight was shot down by a surface-to-air missile, maybe from the coast, but more likely and surprisingly from a nearby Navy ship that was testing targeting systems and launching practice shots around the time of the flight's demise. Over 40 witnesses of the mid-air explosion have suggested that there was a flare of light that traveled up from the ocean to the plane shortly before it exploded. Given the problems with the other hypotheses and the evidence that indicates it was shot down, it seems that we have to accept the third possibility as the most likely, however frightening it may be. Okay, so really interesting argument. A version of this this is a real story. TWA 800 did go down many years ago, and this story and an argument like this circulated around the internet like mad for months, leading many people to think that the Navy actually shot this plane down. So I'm going to reconstruct that argument towards that end. Now, the way to deal with a really big, complicated argument like this is to divide and conquer. Let's break it down into the smaller parts. Again, what's the conclusion? And the conclusion is pretty clear. TWA 800 was shot down. Okay, now what's the overall, and why do I think that's the conclusion? Well, the author says, given the problems with the other 2 hypotheses, it seems that we have to accept the third possibility as the most likely. So there's 3 options that they're considering, and they eliminate, there's my indicator that there are 3 options. 2 are considered and rejected. That's the mechanical failure option and the terrorist bomb, and the conclusion is drawn in favor of the third. So the overall structure of this thing is really quite simple. Either A or B or C is true. It's not A, it's not B, therefore it's got to be C. So there's your basic valid argument pattern. The question is, can we take this gargantuan, this long-winded reasoning here and force it down into this nice simple format? And actually we can make it quite clear. So there's the original passage, and here's the argument. Therefore, TWA 800 was shot down. What are my premises? TWA 800 was either shot down, bombed by terrorists, or it suffered from mechanical failure. Those are the 3 options that this author is explicitly considering as the possibilities. TWA 800 was not bombed by terrorists, and I'm going to take that as an implicit premise. It's something we can draw out from that passage there in the middle. 3, TWA 800 did not suffer from mechanical failure, therefore it was shot down. Very simple, 4 lines. It says either A or B or C happened. It wasn't A, it wasn't B, therefore it's got to be C. That's a very stripped down, sort of skeletal way to do this argument. Now, this would suit me just fine in a homework assignment, but let me show you that you've obviously noticed that there's a lot of detail here that we've left out, a lot of the sub-reasoning, if you will, or the sub-arguments that contribute to these conclusions. So think of this next longer version of the same argument as expanding on the sub-arguments for 2 and 3 in this argument. Okay, so the longer, more elaborate version would have the same conclusion. Therefore, TWA 800 was shot down, and that's because we figure it was either shot down, it was bombed by terrorists, or it was suffered from mechanical failure. Now, what's the reasoning that this author gives for thinking that it wasn't bombed by terrorists? Well, in the passage, the author says something like this: if it was bombed by terrorists, then we would find evidence of a bomb in the wreckage, and there would be a plausible claim of responsibility by a terrorist group. The author seems to be assuming that if those two things were true, then we could maybe more strongly draw the conclusion towards a terrorist bomb. But the author says outright, explicitly, we did not find evidence of a bomb in the wreckage, and there was not a plausible claim of responsibility by a terrorist group. That is, whenever there's an accident or a bombing or some kind of problem like this, there's lots of people who call up the FBI and they say, I did it, I did it, I did it. But most of those are not plausible. We reject most of those out of hand. And that's partly what's led this author to think that it wasn't bombed by terrorists. So the intermediate conclusion from from 2 and 3 is that TWA was not bombed by terrorists. 2 and 3 imply 4. And then when we combine 4 with 1, we're going to get our result down in 8 in a minute. Okay, what's next? What's the other sub-argument? The other sub-argument is if most of the wreckage has been found and searched and there's no evidence of mechanical failure, then TWA did not suffer from mechanical failure. Okay, so the author seems to be implicitly assuming this principle, something like this. Well, if we look for mechanical failure and we can't find it, then it wasn't mechanical failure. And that's fairly plausible, and that makes perfect sense. Of course, you'll notice that in this argument there's a bit of information that seems to undermine this very inference, but we'll leave it alone for a minute. Most of the wreckage has been found and searched, and there's no evidence of mechanical failure. So the author explicitly says 6. When I add 6 to 5, I get this intermediate conclusion. Therefore, TWA did not suffer mechanical failure. So now I've got the 2 sub-arguments, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, 6, and 7, and those support these conclusions, 4 and 7. And so my justification for 8 is 1, 4, and 7. And that's the same as the argument we had on the previous slide that just stripped all of that extra information out. But notice I've done it now with very carefully constructed valid argument steps. So here's a really good, thorough reconstruction. It's even better than the one we had before. Okay. So what do we learn today? Longer arguments can be made up of smaller logical inferences. We're going to add implicit premises where necessary to be charitable and to make the argument strong. We're always looking after deductive strength or inductive strength. We want to make the thing valid or cogent wherever possible. And sometimes the authors imply or they rely on some premise that they don't state explicitly. We have to add that for them to make it logical, to make it the thing work, make it fit. We're also adding intermediate inferences and sub-conclusions in a couple of these cases so that we can draw out the explicit reasoning. And all of this detail and all of this structure is also going to let us do a good job at critical evaluations later. Seemingly complicated arguments often have very simple logical structure. It's easy to divide and conquer here and break it down and say, well, what's the main point and what are the simple reasons that I'm being given to accept the main point? It also should be clear that not every line in the text or not every word in the text should be a line in the reconstructed argument. We're weeding out, trimming out lots of extra information, lots of stuff we don't need. We're just boiling this down to the P's and the Q's and really getting the logical structure clean and simple and straightforward. And the nice thing about this is that, think about the skill. When you write a paper for a sociology class or for your English class or whatever, you're going to write pages and pages, hundreds and hundreds of words to make some case. But now with this skill that we're developing now, you should be able to reconstruct a very pared down, very simple, very clear argument and get very clear in your head, what are my reasons, what's my conclusion? And that could be a sort of outline for the bigger argument you'd want to make, or all the writing you want to do where you justify your premises and you go into the background detail to explain the stuff that supports the argument. But being able to distill out the essential argument is a really valuable skill. It's important to be able to do it in your own reasoning, or think to yourself, what is the basic logical structure or the argument I'm making, or to listen to somebody and to be able to figure out what it is they're getting at and what reasons they're giving. We're eliminating unnecessary information or unnecessary words and trimming these things down and making them simple and clean if we can. And we've also seen that reconstructions allow us to direct specific objections at the premises. It lets us say about premise 1, for instance, it's false. Here's why. I've got these doubts about this principle. It's not true that people should be allowed to sell anything that someone's willing to buy. Nuclear weapons are something that people would like to buy, but we shouldn't allow people to sell them. So the reconstructions let us make specific direct objections at the premises and undermine them and give more effective critical evaluations. Okay, so that's the last lecture I have on argument reconstructions. You're going to need to be able to take this skill and look at a piece of text, look at the homework assignment, reconstruction homework assignment that's coming up next, and look at the passage, and then distill out the argument and build a strong, if possible, deductively or inductively strong argument on behalf of the author who wrote the passage. Thank you.